This is why people shouldn't wait until they're in the problem zone, because intervening when we don't know if you have early dementia or really significant cognitive impairment, would it actually really help you? Or is this sort of this window of opportunity in which you're going to have the most impact with the lifestyle factors?
Hi, and welcome back to The Vitals, the Mount Sinai Health Systems podcast. I'm Dr. Shruti Naik, a scientist at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and your guest host in this special series on healthy lifespans and aging. When people think about getting older, one fear often rises too quickly: losing memory, mental sharpness, and ultimately independence. But what's normal brain aging, and what signals something more serious? How early do biological changes linked to dementia really begin? Today's episode is all about brain span. The years we keep our minds clear, our decision-making steady, and our sense of self intact. Joining me are three experts: Dr. Fanny Elahi, Dr. Joseph Castellano, and Dr. Alison Goate. Together, we'll unpack what happens in the aging brain and what we can do to protect brain health, and also the ambitious XPRIZE trial, testing how different interventions can impact our brain span. If you want to learn more, scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the description below. Folks, welcome to the show. Let's get to it. As many of us get older, as folks get older, people start noticing changes in their memory and their focus. What kind of changes? What's considered normal, quote unquote? And what are signs that people should be concerned about?
So my view on neurodegenerative diseases and aging is that they're on a continuum. And so there isn't really a bucket that you sort of fall into. And at that point, you have to really worry about things. It's been shown now, and increasingly so over the past few years, that there are multiple different trajectories of aging. So some people age incredibly successfully. At 103, they're living independently and handling every affair in their life, while others start developing signs of neurodegenerative diseases as early as their 20s, 30s, 40s. So aging is not equal across the population. And so what I would say is if someone is experiencing change in their brain function, whether it's like mood, anxiety, depression, or inability to do things as well as they used to from a cognitive perspective, and it's progressive in nature as opposed to getting better with lifestyle modifications, fixing different things in their life, they should seek evaluation. Let the physicians tell you whether this is actually something to worry about or whether it's something that you can address with, again, other kinds of lifestyle modifications.
Yeah, I would say, in the past, people used to use cognitive tests and look at a population on a continuum and have cutoffs. But it really is the case that what's important is your change from normal. So looking at an individual, not comparing you against a population. And some individuals will cover this up for longer than others or not admit that they have had some change, and they may still be very good at what they're doing, but they're still a change from baseline, right? You could say some people in the old days would balance their checkbooks, right? Other people never did it. So that wouldn't be a change from normal if you never did it.
So it's sort of like where you start out when you're at your prime. Yeah. And so I guess it seems like who's the best person to identify that? Is that someone, do you recognize that in a family member? Do folks recognize that in themselves? How do folks go about evaluating that?
I start really worrying about someone when others in their life notice it and they don't anymore. So the very first changes, I think the person notices. It kind of depends. If loss of insight is, if parts of the brain that have insight are the ones degenerating first, well, they're not going to be the first noticing. But for the most part, there's this phase of subjective cognitive impairment where the person notices, everyone's like, no, you're fine, you're fine. And they are at higher risk of declining in the future. I do seriously worry when others in that person's life are worried about them.
I would think that people who live together, who are around, are more likely to notice. So, someone who is a partner is more likely to notice than someone who only sees people test the individual from time to time. So there's definitely a difference in the quality of information depending on who you're asking. And obviously, there are also some partners who are just oblivious and don't pick up on these things as well. So, sort of when you're doing memory testing, I mean, or when you're interviewing, sort of close relatives, the quality of the information you get can be quite different.
Absolutely.
So
I have friends and family that have gone in to see physicians when they start having these complaints, and it's one of the reasons they actually really ask, kind of close family member, be sure to come with this person so they can really get that insight.
But I would say that even if the family members or the loved ones say you're fine, that person, if they're worried about themselves, if they notice this sort of change from their baseline, as Alison said, they should seek evaluation.
So you're saying persistent changes, you're the best person to say, something's really not quite right, or we're not really quite thinking the same way, our focus is lost. What are other signs that people could look for? Focus, memory, you're not remembering things as much.
Repeating things. Yeah.
Mood. Okay. So like anxiety.
Anxiety, mood lability, and sort of just feeling off.
What is mood lability?
It's the opposite of stability in mood. So, each person has their own basic fluctuations. And this loss of homeostasis, again, sort of a word that may need to get defined, but it's really this loss of balance. And again, it comes back to that person's baseline. If they've always had sort of unstable mood, it's not really, they would probably not worry about. But if they've been this sort of steady state person and now they're showing more reactivity, they can't really balance their internal state as well, that can actually be the early signs. It's not always, I think the most important thing to know is that it's not always memory or cognition per se. In fact, in large studies, but this is hard to quantify and so harder to study when you're studying neurodegenerative diseases, the mood changes may precede, in a large majority of people, the cognitive decline.
So not engaging, being withdrawn as well.
Yeah, what we call apathy. Yeah. So the sort of inherent lack of motivation. And what's really interesting is that most people, especially if they're young, get labeled as depressed. And because they have this sort of apathy, they're not very reactive to that. And when I end up seeing them and I ask them the question, are you actually depressed? They're not. They just don't care. But the behavior to their loved ones and the outside looks all the same.
And when you say really young, what do you mean? Like 40s, 30s? Wow.
40s, 30s.
Wow, that's early. So
it's incredibly early.
I want to touch upon this idea. You mentioned this briefly, that everybody has their own trajectory of aging, and that, in fact, it starts sometimes as early as you're saying right now, 40s. This has come up a few times now in our series when we talk about aging. Tell me a little bit more about this individualized aging for your brain, and what factors may contribute to that.
Lifestyle factors are absolutely essential. And for a long time, we've known about it, but I was one of the people thinking this is soft. How much can you really modify? But now that we have really powerful molecular tools at our disposal, and we can actually measure biology outside of sort of this placebo effect or function, we know that intervening on your diet with something like Mediterranean diet, doing regular exercise, strength training, not just cardiovascular exercise, intervening on your sleep can really impact your biology in powerful ways. And I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Joe here, who can also address this, but we know that it changes your immune system and it changes the communication between your body and the brain. And so the other thing that I just want to mention is that this is why people shouldn't wait until they're in the problem zone, because intervening we don't know if you have early dementia or really significant cognitive impairment, would it actually really help you? Or is this sort of this window of opportunity in which you're going to have the most impact with the lifestyle factors?
I guess these lifestyle factors also influence your risk for cardiovascular disease, which obviously impacts you earlier in life generally than cognitive decline or dementia. So the earlier you take it, modify your behaviors so that you are sleeping better, exercising more, eating the right diet, the better it's going to be for all aspects.
Stressing less, which is probably the hardest.
The hard one. Yeah, I always find sleep a hard one too.
Right.
Yeah.
I know I should get more than I do.
I mean, all of these things come up as just recurrent themes, right, for our body aging and this idea of proactive sort of intervention before you start decline, because you don't see the decline. It's not visible to you. We hear phrases like brain resilience, cognitive reserve. I want to understand, look, what does that really mean? What do you mean when you say cognitive reserve? I can putting the two words together, it's some kind of brain health, like the reserve in how you're thinking. But I want to understand what that is and how we build it up, if it's good for us, and how you measure it.
What's really fascinating is that we now have great tools to measure pathology that is either driving or is prominently present in brains of individuals that decline all the way to dementia. So amyloid buildup, tau, another protein called TDP-43, alpha-synuclein. We have really good tools to measure these. And the more we measure, and so we started thinking, well, we basically need to measure more to explain the cognitive impairment. But the more we measure, there's a sort of missing variable in the models that explain function. And again, using the same powerful tools that allow us to know that lifestyle actually does impact your biology, we have a growing appreciation of cellular resilience. So in the face of the same injury pathways, some people are more vulnerable to decline, cell death, degeneration, and decline. And some people can handle a lot of injury and still function, and their cells are resilient. So I think the connection between cellular function and brain function is there. And ultimately, I study vasculature. I'm in love with vasculature.
What is vasculature? Blood vessels.
Blood vessels, you got it. But ultimately, the neurons matter, So you can have a ton of blood vessel injury, but if you have resilient neurons, your networks in the brain that are underpinning your function may not decline as fast.
There's actually a very well-known example now in the literature of a woman from a family that carries a mutation in a gene that causes Alzheimer's disease. And everybody in her family was showing dementia in their 50s. And this lady lived until she was in her early 70s and was only very mildly demented when she died. And yet when they looked at her brain, it was full of amyloid pathology. So it wasn't that she didn't have pathology. She's an example of someone who seems to be resilient to the presence of pathology, and her brain cells didn't die. So we know that there's some natural experiments in nature where you can see a 20-year difference. And so I think for all of us doing aging research, that's sort of a powerful message that there are ways that you can prevent decline, even in the presence of pathology.
I think just to jump in on that, I think it's what we're hearing from this is it's really complex, right? Like your brain doesn't age at the same rate in everyone. And that could be genetic. It could be other lifestyle factors. And one thing that my lab studies, and Fanny alluded to this, is, what's happening in the periphery, what's happening in the rest of the body that influences the brain. And some really cool studies have kind of shown that different organs in your body actually age at different rates, and that can kind of influence what's in your blood, and what's in your blood can influence what's in your brain, right? So I think that's another kind of component to this puzzle.
Wow. So different organs age at different rates?
Yeah.
Okay. Which one ages the fastest?
It really depends on the person, I think.
So there's really
there's
no
heterogeneity
blueprint.
I hope my brain is the slowest aging organ in my body.
Yeah.
I want to come back to this idea of genetic risk, but just so I understand what you're saying, Fanny, you're saying that amyloid plaques, which are these proteins that come together and just sort of jam your brain, have been seen in disease, and for a very long time were thought to drive your brain function decline. And now you have a different hypothesis based on the kinds of natural experiments that, in fact, it's not just the proteins clumping together, it's the health of your brain cells. Am I understanding that correctly?
So one of the most interesting things is that some of these findings correlate with disease. So amyloid is a really good example. The plaques, I would say, in the brain, these clunks of amyloid in the brains are a really good example that they're marking disease state. You're at risk of decline, but they've never correlated really nicely with the decline. The other protein that is often present in brains of individuals with Alzheimer, always, because that's how we define it, is tau. That is very predictive of decline. So the more tau, we call them tangles. They sort of stick to each other inside of the cells, inside of the neurons and glia, the more decline you're going to have. What's really interesting in the example that Alison actually gave is that that woman who was resilient to her fate ended up having a mutation that prevented, well, I think it's blood vessels were protected, but it does a lot of different things. And so there is genetic, lifestyle, but really ultimately what it says is that there's not only biology to injury, there's also biology to resisting things that are supposed to be injurious to the cells. This is also why we're really bad at predicting how fast someone declines. And it's a missing, really an important gap, an unmet need in medicine, at least for the brain. And I think if we bring these molecular tools that capture more complex biology, as Joe said, the brain function is very complex, we will be better at predicting who will decline, how fast they will decline. It's going to help clinical trials. It's going to help people plan their life. I see a brighter future with regards to prediction of decline.
So I would just add to this conversation around cognitive reserve that from epidemiological studies, education has always been protective for Alzheimer's disease and dementia generally. And that could be, sort of proxy for a number of different things. But there's also been more recent data that says, if you have an active mind and engage in activities even in later life, so not necessarily what we think of as education, that is protective as well. So sort of brain activity that is active, because you're engaged in things. Yes, exactly. It's really important.
Alison, I want to understand more about genetic risk. Now with things like 23andMe, we can all go out there and see what our genes are. It's very hard to know always what that means, right? So tell me about like genes. For instance, a really common one that people talk about is this ApoE4. So what is it, and how should people think about it?
Yeah, so this is a protein that's actually expressed in a lot of cells in the body. That's the main transporter of cholesterol. Apolipoprotein E is its full name, and it exists in three common forms that differ by a single amino acid within the protein, so subtly different from one another. And if you have the ApoE4, then across all human populations, regardless of ancestry, there is an increase in risk for Alzheimer's disease that seems to be a dose-dependent effect. So if you have one copy of E4, you have in European populations like a threefold increase in risk, whereas if you had two copies, it's more than 10.
Wow.
But different ancestral populations have different risks. So in African Americans, an E4 allele actually it increases your risk, but not to the same extent as it does in Europeans. And in Chinese populations, Japanese populations, it looks like E4 might have a bigger risk. So we're all at risk for Alzheimer's disease depending on the ApoE genotype. And this is something, obviously, you can get from 23andMe if you go and do genetic testing. So people know this. People come into clinics knowing this information. And I think one thing related to the conversation we were having earlier is that this genotype is not destiny. Not everyone who carries an ApoE4 allele is going to get Alzheimer's disease. And we don't really understand at this point why some people do and some people don't. It's just relative to people with a different genotype, you're at higher risk. Certainly, if you engage in the activities that we were talking about, exercise, Mediterranean diet, sleep, etc., you will reduce your risk, whatever your ApoE genotype is. So it's an important thing to do.
I like that message. Very hopeful that, there is no destiny. You control your destiny in many ways, and you can intervene and start, early.
ApoE4 is a greater risk for women. And I think we should also talk about the fact that women are actually at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. This is really a lot of money and resources should go to understanding what that vulnerability is, biologically speaking. One of the vulnerable periods in women's life is menopause. So I think there are now some projects underway, and we're also working on that to understand what exactly about menopause in women could potentially put them at high risk. But E4 is also an entry point into that biology because women are at high risk carrying E4. So the science is really exciting, and I'm keeping an open mind as my colleagues are. I think when emerging science, exciting new discoveries come, there's maybe too rapid a commercialization of that. And we're still understanding who it can help, how it can help, and really reducing it to maybe factors, minimum necessary and sufficient. We all think that drugging aging is probably a good thing. Lifestyle, because we want to be really ambitious. We want to extend health span by decades, not just a few years. And so lifestyle changes may gain number of years, maybe a decade, but we probably need to also drug, chemically modify cellular function. And so this is really promising. I mean, I really, really believe in our scientific method for determining what helps or hurts people and who should benefit, but we're slow. And that is really frustrating. But we do need to speed this up. And I really hope that the FDA will agree to biomarker readouts because there are so many therapies to test. We want to test them. And in order to get the answers, to actually finally have protocols for people to rejuvenate them, to extend health span, we can't take 5 years per trial per intervention. We really need to revolutionize how we determine therapies work or don't work, go-no-goes and de-risking. And I think the very first thing is to say, is it safe? And is there some data? And then can we basically do it in a more cost-effective way? Do we really need several phase 3 large, deeply phenotyped trials? Or can we be more creative so that we have solutions faster?
Treating aging as a disease, right?
Treating aging as a disease. And at that point, you really need biomarker readouts because we discussed how noisy function is.
I want to get back to this idea of isolating factors, studying the factors in the blood that in your studies could help rejuvenation and providing those factors. I can hear people in their mind saying, well, that doesn't seem very natural. Like the plasma seems more natural. Tell me a little bit more about why because it seems like there's consensus on this with all three of you, that it's better to understand, precisely measure, and that's something that we really advocate for, and then give in really specific amounts. Tell me about why that approach that you all seem to agree on is better than the natural,
I mean, I would argue it's the same argument as we have over natural products which are completely unregulated and medicines that are approved by the FDA, right? That when a medicine's been approved, that there has to be a certain level of purity and we need to know the activity so that every time you take it, it's having the same effect. With natural products, you don't know whether the amount of the active ingredient is the same in every batch of natural product.
And it's still a chemical. I think there's this idea that if you get it from a plant, it's natural, it's like what we're meant to do, but not really. I mean, it was never, for that problem for which you're taking it. And it's a chemical. At the end of the day, The FDA maybe a little bit too slowly, but they have a really good system for determining what's actually helpful and what's safe. And that safety is a really big deal, which if you go all natural, you're not controlling as many parameters and you could be actually very unsafe.
Yeah, there's just so much, using plasma as an example, there's so much in that we don't really know. Everyone's very heterogeneous, right? So how is this pool created, right? Like something else we kind of study is how genetic background changes what's in the blood. So that's something that you wouldn't want to have like a sort of dim view on.
So the way you're reacting is sort of your genes. For instance, if you have an ApoE4 type of gene that causes aging or that predisposes you to certain aging phenomenon, and the lifestyle factors that are together.
And environment.
And environment. So what does that mean? What does environment mean? Tell me.
Gosh, very scary things. I think we know that they're forever chemicals, PFAS, plastics. And what was really scary to me is that I got rid of all the plastics in my kitchenware, but that's not the major source. Vegetables grown in soil with water that's polluted and soil that's polluted are a big reservoir of these chemicals that are very harmful. And we know from brain tissue investigations that you accumulate them in your brain, similar to what Joe was saying, that the good proteins are getting in, they're also getting in. And we don't actually know exactly what they're doing, but they're there forever. So I think environmental studies is a next big frontier for brain research. And I think the more we're able to measure these things, the less variables we have that's unaccounted for. And I think we're going to build better predictive models.
I think one of the problems in the past so you need to do large epidemiological studies to identify these environmental components, but at least the ones that were done in previous decades, the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease was a clinical one which was really contaminated with other dementias. So I think it's just then harder to find what those environmental components are. Now that we have molecular ways, like the biomarkers as Fanny studies, to be able to determine whether someone who's got some memory impairment actually has impairment because they have Alzheimer's disease, it will make it easier to find these environmental components that are affecting risk. Because I think there have been a few studies around pollution, right? Generally, I don't know how much we know about the specific aspects of, which pollutants are worst, but if you have that fuzziness around the definition of Alzheimer's disease, because you can't tell it from other dementias, then you're only really going to be able to reliably pick up environmental components that affect all dementias.
So I think really good studies, really good testing, I think this is a great point to pivot to the trial.
We're incredibly excited about the trial, and I hope that this is the start of many trials for aging.
Folks, if you want to know more about the trial, scan the QR code or click the link below in the description. So I want to get to the trial because it seems like it really is measuring a lot of these things. Tell me more about, what are you measuring in the XPRIZE trial? How are you measuring cognitive function?
We are measuring function because we have to, because I think as a society, we have not given up on function per se, which is like how fast you can do things, how accurately you can do it. We call it executive function as a whole. That's sort of what changes most with aging. But what I'm most excited about is what we've talked about, these molecular markers of function and health of the brain cells. Some of them get spilled into your blood as the cells are degenerating, and others go up when you have inflammation, the sort of inflammaging, which people talk about also happens to the brain, and these levels go up. Other markers are measuring the health of blood vessels. So we're going to be very comprehensive because in this new era of precision medicine, we don't want to go by very, very coarse measures. And we think the first things that we're going to move are actually going to be the molecular measures of health and disease in the brain.
So you're going to see the changes in the molecules before you see the changes in, for instance, the way the person's brain is lighting up or working.
Yes. And through studies, thankfully, in various kinds of societies in the US, in China, in Europe, people have collected blood samples. And these are sort of continued longitudinal studies. And we know that at least, the markers of Alzheimer's disease can become abnormal up to 20 years before people start experiencing any symptoms. And since we think of aging and sort of degeneration on a continuum, there's a lot more than just biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. So for this trial of aging, we're going to be more extensive than just looking at Alzheimer's disease, which is probably not going to be abnormal in many people in this trial. Alzheimer's disease is one of the many things that happen to the aging brain.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of analogous to how we think about heart disease, right? That we measure our cholesterol levels when we're much younger than when we would expect to have a heart attack. And now we put people on statins, 30s and 40s is not uncommon, right? So ultimately, that's what we'll be looking for is drugs that we can give to people when they have no change in their cognition, but they're showing changes in their biomarkers that we would like to reverse so that we can prevent them getting demented.
You want annual blood checkups for brain health.
You want annual blood checkups for brain health.
I do.
Yeah.
I think that's terrific.
Yeah.
Investing in your health.
50 and up.
50 and up.
30.
But definitely.
So I think this is really great that you're measuring things. I want to understand, you guys are going to be measuring exercise and various supplements and various treatments and how they impact it. How is this different than, for instance, I see a lot of supplements like brain health, memory focus, and it says science-backed, right? Or, physician recommended. How is what you're doing maybe, or is it the same as that? Is it different? Or, how, as me as a consumer, as a viewer sitting at home, thinking about what proactive steps I can take, where do you sit on these brain health supplements?
I'm going to speak for myself, but I think we all share the opinion that we're very open-minded. We don't think that the supplements are garbage. I think the problem that we have with it is, first of all, is that supplement that's actually saying what's in it true? And so for this trial, we're using very serious pharmacists that are putting together these chemicals that we're going to give. And that's the major problem. Because these supplements are not regulated, we don't actually know what they contain. And we know already that many that are advertised actually don't contain exactly the same amounts or even exactly what they're supposed to contain. But most importantly, what I'm most excited about is that we're going to have tools that are going to allow us to test whether we're impacting aging or not. And beyond what we're going to test in XPRIZE, hopefully we're successful and we can rejuvenate. But beyond this, we're going to have a pathway to do clinical trials for aging. And hopefully we can test many of these supplements and give people answers. They do help, they don't help.
Yeah, one thing that helps actually, from my perspective, we take that information, we cycle it back into experimental models so we can actually look at this more, mechanistically, and then hopefully that motivates the next clinical.
And what I'm hoping is that we can test it in cells, because now we have really incredible and pretty good humanized cellular models.
So it's not just good enough to know that it works. We must know, well, first of all, we need to measure that it works, and then we must know how it's working.
I think that the science on the supplements, most of it's pretty soft, right? And so probably we would all agree that if the supplements, if there's not negative consequences of taking the supplements, then if the science is soft, well, you can take it, but it may not do you any good, right?
$60 for a month.
Right?
Yeah.
Or more. Yeah, for some of these things, they're not cheap. Yeah, right. Well, and I think the point of what's being done for the XPRIZE is that this is the beginning of a rigorous trial, right? So that we'll be able to really say whether or not these drugs work.
This is so exciting. It just seems like a complete game changer in how we're going to think about aging and how we're going to think about health. I want to talk a little bit about, sensationalized reporting of scientific findings. Joe, you're very measured in how you're saying things, and you're very careful because a lot of the science still needs to be done, right? But very often we see, like you'll see all over socials or even in the, mainstream media, like game changing, we've now solved this problem. And I want to understand from your perspectives, are there any such game changers currently? How should people really think about evaluating what that means when they read in the media? This is a game changer.
I mean, I would say generally things need to be replicated for us to believe that it can be a game changer. But I can give you an example of something I think has been a game changer, and I'm sure Fanny does too, and that is the development of blood biomarkers in Alzheimer's disease, right? That blood is obviously accessible. We're all used to having our blood drawn when we go to the primary care physician. And so the fact that you can do a test to tell whether someone is likely to be developing Alzheimer's disease from taking a blood sample. Before, we had to do a brain scan, right? So we're spending thousands of dollars to find out whether or not someone has the pathology in their brain. And now you can do it by measuring it in the blood. So to me, that is an example of a science and medicine game changer. But even that, it took a number of years while we were testing to make sure that these results were reliable, right? Because you've got to always compare the new thing with the old gold standard to make sure that it is measuring the same thing. So I would say sort of beware when you read about game changers in the media that, it sells the paper or gets clicks online or whatever, but science moves more slowly than that.
I would agree with all of that. I have no notes on most of that, but I do think it's important to be excited about your science. But at the same time, there is kind of an emerging cottage industry of influencers who kind of, peddle something that looks exciting, right? But they haven't done the work of vetting whether this is replicated or whether it's based in something that's a little harder, right? So,
two things. One, high five to Alison. Very excited that she mentioned that as a game changer. It's the methodology. It's the tools that we have that I think have actually turned a page on our discovery process. It is an absolute game changer. And I think the biomarkers that we have is just the beginning. We're developing more comprehensive molecular tools that are just as accurate and can measure more of the pathology, and especially these aging trajectories that are not just frank disease, but more of sort of more or less of the same biological system. The other thing, I think, I don't want to advocate for these sensational, news headings, but the scientific enterprise is not all eureka moments. It's a lot of hard work and for very few results. So I think that's sometimes, at least when the scientists are talking about it, when we talk about our discovery, we don't think that we've cured the disease, but oh my God, how much work went into that. It's really cool to discover even a small bit of something that is adding to the body of knowledge.
I really like that. First of all, because folks always ask me, why does it take you so long to do anything in medicine? Why does it take so long? But, Alison, what you're saying is it should take long. Built into our system of science is that you make a discovery and then somebody else tests that discovery again. And then somebody else tests it again. And only when all these people have tested it and it's stood the test of time that it becomes the real deal, that it becomes the game changer.
And there are a lot of results, right? There are a ton of results, but they don't make it into the news. So it's not like we're sitting and then all of a sudden there's a game changer, right? There are results almost on a daily basis, good or bad, something works and we disprove something, we show something. So there are a lot of different steps to building towards a finding.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably tens of thousands of papers published on Alzheimer's disease every year. Yes, too many to actually be aware of everything that's going on.
Yeah, but because I think the public is now hearing, science is not reproducible and all of what their taxpayer dollars are going to is, things that are not being useful or being reproduced in pharma. So I really the idea that this is built into our system. This is how we do science. This is science. Reproducibility is science. That to me is very powerful.
I mean, you mentioned the idea of speed, I think, is interesting since you brought up replication. There's this newer idea, I don't know if you've seen this, about like slow science, right? Yeah. So taking a longer period of time to produce something that's maybe more trustworthy, maybe something that's more careful. So I kind of like that idea.
And another part of our life that is in the dark is how much time we spend raising funds. If we were just continuously funded, we would probably go at least twice as fast. I just have to say that. So there's a lot of passion and a lot of hard work to the point where each lab is its own startup, basically. And you're continuously sort of raising funds to do more. So these are all part of the pace, but we're at work every single day.
Well, I mean, I think if the American taxpayer wants faster science, you know what you need to do? Double the NIH budget. I have a very personal stake in this question. So that's my disclaimer. Recently I read this article where they suggested or they mentioned that drinking coffee every day sharpens your brain function. Now, is that true? Is that correct? What is the science behind that?
You definitely feel sharper. Yeah. But so it's very, very interesting. I think it's very complex. I mean, there are disease states in which it's been studied more, say, Parkinson's disease and the metabolites of coffee, how it's processed. But I think overall what Alison was saying actually in the beginning of education being related to resilience. So without hard science, I think the short answer is we don't know. But how I'm explaining it to myself is that coffee stimulates you. It's not like you take coffee and you go to bed or you like sit and watch TV. I mean, some people may, but most people are taking it and they're getting more active. And so that behavior almost has a component. But if it sharpens you to recruit more brain, that may be in of itself a pathway towards the benefits of coffee. So this is just one explanation. But again, we can study it. Yeah. We now have tools, and we should use it.
This study. If you want to fund this
I will participate in it.
Contact us at Mount Sinai to understand that coffee makes you smarter. So thank you guys so much for coming. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Here's the bottom line, folks. Brainspan is built, not inherited. Dementia is not an inevitable part of aging. While genetics can shape risk, the day-to-day factors like sleep, blood pressure, movement, metabolic health, hearing, and social connection can all influence brain resilience, and many of them are modifiable. That's also what the XPRIZE Healthspan trial is testing. Whether targeted, science-guided interventions can measurably improve biological markers of brain health. That's it for this special edition of The Vitals on Healthspan and Longevity. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Fanny Elahi, Dr. Joseph Castellano, and Dr. Alison Goate. I'm your host, Dr. Shruti Naik. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening, and take care of your future self.